The iron taste of gunpowder still lingered in Victoria Adams' mouth as she lowered the smoking pistol, her hand steady despite the horror reflected in her cornflower blue eyes. At 32, she hadn't expected to be burying her third husband before autumn's first frost painted the Montana Territory in crimson and gold. Yet here she stood widowed for the third time in 7 years, with whispers of Black Widow trailing her like persistent shadows through the dusty streets of Copper Creek. "God rest your soul, Thomas," she whispered, watching as the undertaker's assistants lifted her late husband's body from the muddy street where he'd fallen during what should have been a routine cattle deal. Victoria knew the stares boring into her back weren't just from curiosity, they carried suspicion, fear, and in some cases, thinly veiled hostility. The year was 1875, and life in Montana Territory demanded grit from even the hardiest souls. Victoria had come west as a bright-eyed bride of 25, married to a man who promised her adventure and prosperity but delivered only 6 months of marriage before consumption claimed him. Her second husband, a shopkeeper with kind eyes and gentle hands, lasted nearly 3 years before a stray bullet during a bank robbery left her a widow once more. Now Thomas dead from what appeared to be a business disagreement gone horribly wrong. "Mrs. Adams," Sheriff Miller approached, his weathered face creased with concern. "I need to ask you about what happened." Victoria's spine straightened. "As I told you when it happened, Sheriff, those men came to discuss cattle prices with Thomas. I was bringing them coffee when the shouting started. By the time I returned with my gun, that man," she pointed at a body being loaded into a separate wagon, "had already shot my husband. I defended myself, as is my right." The sheriff nodded slowly, though doubt flickered in his eyes. "Third time's mighty peculiar, Mrs. Adams. Are you suggesting I somehow orchestrated my husband's murder, Sheriff?" Victoria's voice remained steady despite the fury building inside her. "That I have made a habit of widowhood." Sheriff Miller removed his hat, running calloused fingers through graying hair. "No, madam, but others are. Might be best if you considered leaving Copper Creek. People talk." "This is my home," Victoria replied, though she knew he was right. The whispers had started after her second husband's death, quiet at first, then growing louder with each passing month. Now, with Thomas dead, those whispers would become shouts. "Madam," the sheriff hesitated, "the stage leaves for Helena tomorrow morning. I'd suggest you be on it." Victoria watched him walk away, her heart hammering against her ribs. 3 husbands, 3 funerals, 3 rounds of black crepe and sympathetic nods that had gradually transformed into suspicious glances and cross streets. She'd survived worse than town gossip, but even she had limits. That night, Victoria packed 2 trunks with her most essential belongings: practical dresses, a few pieces of jewelry, her father's pocket watch, and the derringer that had saved her life. By dawn, she had sold the small ranch Thomas had purchased for them to a neighboring farmer for far less than its worth. By mid-morning, she was aboard the eastbound stagecoach, leaving behind the only place she'd called home since leaving her parents' house in Pennsylvania. "Where you headed, miss?" asked an elderly woman sharing the coach. "East," Victoria replied simply, unwilling to offer more information than necessary. "Running from something?" the woman persisted, her rheumy eyes sharp with curiosity. Victoria turned to face the window, watching Copper Creek disappear into the distance. "No, madam. Running towards something, I hope." The journey to Helena took 2 days of bone-jarring travel over rugged terrain. From Helena, Victoria caught another stage heading north toward the burgeoning town of Silver Falls, where no one would know her name or her history. With each mile, she felt both the relief of escape and the weight of starting anew. Silver Falls emerged from the landscape like a mirage, larger than Copper Creek, but still raw and unfinished, with muddy streets lined by a mixture of sturdy wooden buildings and hastily constructed tents. Mines dotted the surrounding hills, and the constant flow of men, wagons, and livestock gave the town an energy Victoria found both intimidating and promising. "Last stop, Silver Falls," the driver called, bringing the stage to a halt before the town's only hotel, a 3-story wooden structure with peeling paint and a crooked sign proclaiming it the Silver Nugget Hotel. Victoria stepped down from the coach, her legs stiff from the journey. A young boy rushed forward to help with her trunks. "That's the Silver Nugget, madam." $2 a night. Includes breakfast, he informed her, already heaving one of her trunks toward the hotel entrance. Thank you, Victoria replied, pressing a coin into his palm once they reached the hotel's small lobby. The clerk, a thin man with spectacles perched on a prominent nose, looked up from his ledger. Room for the night? For the foreseeable future, Victoria corrected. I'll need a room for at least a month. The clerk's eyebrows rose. A month? Not many ladies stay that long without family. You got business in Silver Falls, Mississippi. Mrs. Victoria Adams, she replied, emphasizing her marital status. And yes, I intend to establish myself here. Well, Mrs. Adams, rooms by the month are $6 a week, paid in advance. The clerk eyed her cautiously. If you don't mind my asking, what kind of establishment are you planning? Victoria understood his implication immediately. I'm a seamstress, Mr. Perkins. Harold Perkins. Mr. Perkins, I am a respectable widow with skills in dressmaking, tailoring, and fine needlework. I intend to open a shop as soon as I find suitable premises. The clerk's suspicion faded somewhat. Well, Mrs. Adams, Silver Falls could use a good seamstress. The miners' wives have been complaining about having to order their dresses from Helena. Victoria paid for 2 weeks in advance and followed a young maid to a small but clean room on the second floor. Once alone, she sank onto the narrow bed, exhaustion washing over her in waves. She had exactly $842 to her name, the proceeds from the rushed sale of the ranch, minus what she'd already spent on travel. It would have to be enough to start a new life. The next morning, Victoria rose early, dressed in a practical navy blue dress with minimal bustle, and ventured into Silver Falls to acquaint herself with the town and locate potential shop spaces. The main street bustled with activity, miners heading to their claims, merchants opening their establishments, and the constant flow of wagons bringing supplies from the railway station 30 miles east. Morning, madam, a gruff voice called as Victoria sidestepped a puddle of questionable origin. She turned to find a tall man with a star on his chest, the local lawman. Good morning, Sheriff, she replied, keeping her voice neutral. Marshal, actually. Marshal Wyatt. Haven't seen you around before. His eyes, a startling shade of green, assessed her with professional interest. Victoria Adams. I arrived yesterday from Helena. Visiting family, he asked, falling into step beside her. No, I'm establishing a dressmaking business. Would you happen to know of any available shop spaces? The marshal scratched his beard thoughtfully. Milliner's shop closed down last month when Mrs. Halloway moved back east. Building's still vacant, far as I know. 2 doors down from the assayer's office. Victoria thanked him and continued her exploration, locating the former millinery shop, a modest storefront with large windows and a small apartment above. A faded sign in the window directed inquiries to the bank across the street. By noon, Victoria had negotiated a 3-month lease, purchased basic furniture from the town's general store, and ordered fabric and notions to be delivered from Helena. Within a week, Adams Fine Tailoring and Dressmaking opened for business. Victoria worked diligently, creating window displays of sample garments that showcased her skill with needle and thread. The women of Silver Falls, starved for fashion and quality clothing, quickly became regular customers, and Victoria found herself with a steady stream of orders for everyday dresses, Sunday best garments, and even wedding attire. For 6 months, Victoria built her business and her reputation in Silver Falls. She attended church on Sundays, joined the Ladies' Aid Society, and carefully maintained the persona of a respectable widow focusing on her trade. If she sometimes startled at loud noises or kept her loaded derringer in her apron pocket, no one seemed to notice or comment. Until June 17, 1876, when the stagecoach brought not just mail and supplies, but a tall, broad-shouldered man whose eyes scanned the town with the watchful gaze of someone who had seen too much of life's harsher realities. Jacob Rutherford stepped down from the stage, his worn leather boots landing firmly in the dust of Silver Falls Main Street. At 36, he carried himself with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to handling whatever challenges came his way. His dark hair, streaked with premature silver at the temples, was cut short beneath a black Stetson that had seen better days. First time in Silver Falls? The stage driver asked as he handed down Jacob's saddle and rucksack. Yep, Jacob replied, adjusting his gun belt, not the flashy rig of a gunslinger, but the practical weapon of a man who had needed it too often. Where's the best place to get a meal and information about ranch work? Silver Dollar Saloon serves decent food. As for ranch work, the Blackwater spreads, always hiring. Owners named McAllister tough, but fair. Jacob thanked him and made his way toward the saloon, passing a neat storefront with elegant dresses displayed in the window. Through the glass, he caught a glimpse of a woman with auburn hair pinned in a practical knot, her head bent over fabric as she worked a sewing machine with practiced ease. Something about her posture straight-backed, yet somehow guarded, caught his attention, but he continued toward the promise of a hot meal and potential employment. Victoria glanced up just as the stranger passed her window, struck by something familiar in his measured gait. She'd seen men like him before, competent, dangerous when necessary, but not seeking trouble. Her late husband Thomas had moved with similar purpose before his temper got the better of him that fateful day in Copper Creek. Mrs. Adams? Her customer's voice pulled Victoria back to the present. About the lace on the collar? Yes, Mrs. Thornton. I think the Brussels lace would be most flattering with your coloring. Victoria forced herself to focus on her client's needs, pushing aside the brief but unsettling moment of recognition. Later that afternoon, Victoria was just closing her shop when Marshall Wyatt appeared at her door. Evening, Mrs. Adams. Got a minute? Victoria's heart stuttered. Had someone from Copper Creek recognized her? Had the whispers followed her to Silver Falls? Of course, Marshall. Is something wrong? Not wrong, exactly. Town council's organizing a midsummer social next weekend. Thought you might be willing to help with decorations, being as you've got an eye for such things. Relief loosened the knot in Victoria's chest. I'd be happy to help. Appreciate it. Oh, and there's a new fella in town, Cowboy type, name of Rutherford. Took a job with McAllister. Seems decent enough, but thought you should know, him being right across from your place and all. Victoria followed the marshal's gesture to see that the stranger she'd noticed earlier was now leaning against a post outside the hotel, directly across from her shop. As if sensing their attention, he looked up, nodded once to the marshal, then let his gaze linger on Victoria for a moment that stretched just beyond courtesy. Thank you for the information, Marshal, Victoria said, turning away from the window. Will there be anything else? No, madam. Just looking out for the town's respectable ladies. With a tip of his hat, the marshal departed, leaving Victoria alone with her thoughts and a strange, unfamiliar flutter in her stomach that she hadn't felt since before her first husband's courtship. Jacob Rutherford settled quickly into life at the Blackwater Ranch, earning McAllister's grudging respect with his skill with horses and cattle. On Saturdays, he rode into Silver Falls for supplies and to enjoy a proper meal at the hotel restaurant, which served fare considerably better than the ranch cook's efforts. Each visit, he found himself passing by Adam's fine tailoring and dressmaking, sometimes catching a glimpse of its proprietress through the window. Widow, ain't she? Asked Sam, one of the younger ranch hands who occasionally accompanied Jacob to town. So I hear, Jacob replied, keeping his tone neutral. Pretty one, too. Wonder why she ain't remarried. Jacob shrugged. Not everyone's looking for marriage. Sam grinned. You ain't curious? Word is she buried 3 husbands before coming to Silver Falls. Jacob's head snapped toward his companion. Where'd you hear that? Fella passing through mentioned it. Said she was from some place called Copper Creek. They called her the Black Widow there. Jacob frowned. Gossip's a poor substitute for truth, Sam. Maybe, but 3 dead husbands seems mighty suspicious. Mighty suspicious is how fast you'll find yourself face down in the dirt if she hears you spreading tales, Jacob warned, his voice taking on an edge that made the younger man step back. Just repeating what I heard, is all. Jacob left Sam at the general store and continued down the street, his thoughts troubled. The woman he'd observed over the past month didn't match the picture Sam's gossip painted. She moved with precision and purpose, worked hard, and kept to herself not unlike Jacob himself. But 3 husbands? That would explain the wariness he'd sensed in her. His boots carried him to the door of her shop before he'd fully decided to enter. A small bell announced his arrival, and Victoria Adams looked up from her workbench, recognition and something like alarm flashing in her eyes before a professional mask slipped into place. Good afternoon, she greeted him. How may I help you? Jacob removed his hat, suddenly aware of his dust-covered clothes and 3-day growth of beard. "Madam, I was wondering if you might repair a coat for me. Tore the sleeve pretty bad breaking a new horse." Victoria gestured to the counter. "I'd be happy to examine it." "Your name, sir?" "Jacob Rutherford. I work for McAllister out at Blackwater." "The new ranch hand," she nodded. "Marshall Wyatt mentioned you." Jacob laid his torn jacket on the counter, watching as Victoria's capable hands assessed the damage. Her fingers were slender but strong, with calluses that spoke of years of needlework. "I can repair this," she said after a moment. "It will be $3, and I can have it ready by Wednesday." "That would be fine, Mrs. Adams." Jacob hesitated, then added, "I understand you're fairly new to Silver Falls yourself." Victoria's fingers stilled momentarily before she continued writing out a receipt. "Yes, I arrived last fall. And you, Mr. Rutherford? What brings you to Montana Territory?" "Work mostly. Been moving around since the war ended." "Confederate or Union?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral. "Union. 8th Illinois Cavalry." Something in her expression softened slightly. "My father served with the 4th Pennsylvania." "Good men, the Pennsylvania regiments," Jacob nodded. "He make it home?" "No," Victoria replied simply. "He did not." Jacob accepted the receipt she handed him, their fingers brushing briefly. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Adams." "It was a long time ago, Mr. Rutherford." She stepped back, re-establishing professional distance. "Your coat will be ready Wednesday after 4. Jacob nodded, replaced his hat, and turned to leave. At the door, he paused. "Mrs. Adams? The town social's coming up Saturday next. Would you consider allowing me to escort you?" Victoria's surprise was evident in the slight widening of her eyes. "That's very kind, Mr. Rutherford, but I don't. Just as neighbors," he clarified. Nothing more intended. Victoria studied him for a long moment. "Very well, Mr. Rutherford. As neighbors." Jacob tipped his hat and departed, wondering what had possessed him to issue the invitation. He'd managed 11 years since the war's end without entangling himself with a woman, preferring the simplicity of ranch work and occasional companionship that came with no expectations. Yet something about Victoria Adams, her self-containment, perhaps, or the shadows behind her eyes that matched his own, had prompted an uncharacteristic impulse. Victoria watched Jacob Rutherford's tall figure disappear down the street, her heart beating an uneven rhythm against her ribs. What had possessed her to accept his invitation? After Thomas's death and the painful exodus from Copper Creek, she'd sworn off any involvement with men. Her shop was thriving. She had a small but comfortable apartment, and most importantly, she had independence precious and hard-won. Yet Jacob Rutherford had an air of quiet competence that reminded her of her father, a man who'd taught her to shoot straight, speak honestly, and judge people by their actions rather than their words. And unlike most men in Silver Falls, Jacob hadn't looked at her with either predatory interest or suspicious judgment. Just recognition, somehow, as if he saw past her carefully constructed facade to the woman beneath. "Foolishness," Victoria muttered to herself, returning to her sewing. "Pure foolishness." Wednesday came quickly, and Jacob returned for his repaired coat promptly at 4. Victoria had done an exceptional job. The tear was nearly invisible, with only the most careful examination revealing where the fabric had been mended. "This is impressive work, Mrs. Adams," Jacob said, running his thumb over the repair. "Can barely tell it was damaged." "Thank you, Mr. Rutherford. It's always satisfying when a repair can be made invisible." Jacob paid her the agreed-upon sum, adding an extra 50 cents that Victoria tried to refuse. "You earned it," he insisted. "Quality work deserves fair compensation." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Marshall Wyatt, whose expression was unusually grave. "Mrs. Adams, Mr. Rutherford, glad I caught you both." "Is something wrong, Marshall?" Victoria asked. "Got word from the telegraph office. Seems a man's been asking questions about you and Helena, Mrs. Adams. Described as mid-40s, well-dressed, traveling with 2 hired guns. Operator thought you should know, given your circumstances." Victoria's face drained of color. "Did they mention a name?" "Fellow called Preston. Said he was representing some business interests in Copper Creek." Jacob watched as Victoria's composure cracked, fear briefly visible before she regained control. "I see. Thank you for informing me, Marshall." After Wyatt departed, Jacob remained, his expression thoughtful. Trouble from your past, Mrs. Adams? Victoria busied herself straightening already neat stacks of fabric. Nothing that concerns Silver Falls or its residents, Mr. Rutherford. Concerned you enough to pale like you'd seen a ghost, Jacob observed quietly. And anything that brings armed men to town concerns me. Victoria looked up sharply. Why would it concern you? We're barely acquaintances. Because I've seen what happens when trouble rides into peaceful towns, Jacob replied, his voice level. And because whatever's chasing you has put fear in your eyes, which suggests it's not justice but something else entirely. Victoria's hand stilled. You know nothing about me or my situation, Mr. Rutherford. I know you work hard, keep to yourself, and have built a respectable business in less than a year, Jacob countered. I also know that rumors follow you 3 husbands, all dead. What I don't know is the truth, and I find myself curious about that. Curiosity can be dangerous, Victoria warned, her voice low. So can running alone when someone's hunting you, Jacob responded. He placed his repaired coat over his arm and moved toward the door. Our arrangement for Saturday stands, Mrs. Adams. Unless you'd prefer I stay closer in the meantime. Victoria shook her head. That won't be necessary. Thank you for your concern, but I've managed my affairs for quite some time without assistance. Jacob nodded, though his eyes reflected doubt. As you wish. Good day, Mrs. Adams. After he left, Victoria locked the shop door and leaned against it, struggling to control her breathing. Preston, Silas Preston, Thomas's former business partner, and the man who'd orchestrated the confrontation that led to her husband's death. The man whose associate she'd shot in self-defense. The man who'd stood up in Copper Creek's crowded saloon and declared that Victoria had deliberately lured Thomas into a trap. Victoria had hoped foolishly. It seemed that leaving Montana territory altogether might have been enough to discourage Preston's vindictiveness. Apparently, she'd underestimated his resources and his determination. That night, Victoria slept with her Derringer under her pillow and her father's old army revolver on the bedside table. Come morning, she would need to make decisions, stay and face whatever Preston brought to Silver Falls, or run again, abandoning the life she'd worked so hard to build. Dawn found her still undecided, fatigue pulling at her eyes as she opened her shop precisely at 8 as always. Business proceeded normally until mid-afternoon, when the bell above the door jangled and Jacob Rutherford entered, his expression grim. Mrs. Adams, I need a word. Victoria glanced at her customer, a miner's wife who was selecting fabric for a new dress. I'm with a client, Mr. Rutherford. Perhaps later, now, Jacob insisted, his tone brooking no argument. It's important. Victoria excused herself and followed Jacob to a corner of the shop. What is so urgent that you would interrupt my business? Preston and his men arrived on the noon stage, Jacob said quietly. They're at the Silver Dollar now, asking questions about you. Marshal Wyatt's keeping an eye on them, but he can't interfere unless they break the law. Victoria's hand went instinctively to her pocket, where her Derringer rested. I see. No, I don't think you do, Jacob replied. One of Preston's men is Luther Dane. I recognized him from a wanted poster in Wyoming. He's killed at least 4 men that the law knows about. And what would you suggest I do, Mr. Rutherford? Run again? Hi. Jacob's eyes, gray as storm clouds, held hers steadily. I suggest you tell me the truth, so I can help you. Victoria glanced at her customer, who was pretending not to listen while examining a bolt of calico. This isn't the time or place. Then close early, Jacob insisted. These aren't men who make social calls, Mrs. Adams. Whatever grievance Preston has, he didn't bring Dane along to discuss it over tea. Victoria hesitated, then nodded once. Very well. Give me 15 minutes to finish with Mrs. Collins and close the shop. Jacob stepped outside to wait, his hand resting casually near his holstered Colt. Victoria completed her business with Mrs. Collins, arranged for the delivery of the selected fabrics, and locked the shop door, turning the sign to closed despite it being only 4 in the afternoon. We can speak in my apartment, she told Jacob, leading him to the narrow staircase at the back of the shop. It's more private than the street. Jacob followed her up to a small but tidy apartment consisting of a sitting room, a bedroom visible through a partially open door, and a tiny kitchen. Victoria gestured to one of 2 chairs flanking a small table, then took the other. What do you want to know, Mr. Rutherford? The truth about Copper Creek, about your husbands, and about why Preston is hunting you with a known killer at his side. Victoria folded her hands in her lap, her knuckles white with tension. My first husband, William, died of consumption 6 months after we married. It was quick and brutal, and I nursed him until the end. My second husband, Edward, owned a general store in Copper Creek. He was killed during a robbery when he tried to protect a young woman customer. I was widowed at 28 with no family and few prospects. She paused, gathering her thoughts. Thomas Adams was Copper Creek's most successful cattle broker. He was 15 years my senior, but kind and respectful. We married a year after Edward's death, and for almost 3 years, I believed I'd finally found stability. Her voice faltered. What I didn't know was that Thomas had a business arrangement with Silas Preston that involved selling inferior cattle to the Indian agents at the reservation while charging the government for prime stock. Jacob's expression darkened. A common enough swindle, but a despicable one. When I discovered what was happening, I confronted Thomas. He promised to end the arrangement. Victoria's eyes grew distant with memory. But Preston wasn't willing to let such a profitable venture die. He and 2 of his men confronted Thomas in the street. I heard shouting and went to see what was happening. One of Preston's men shot Thomas, then turned his gun on me. I had my Derringer. I've carried it since Edward's death. I fired first. Self-defense, Jacob observed. Yes, but Preston immediately began spreading rumors that I'd orchestrated the whole confrontation, that I'd somehow lured Thomas into a trap to be rid of him. The whispers about my previous husbands, which had been just malicious gossip until then, suddenly seemed sinister to the townspeople. The sheriff suggested I leave before someone decided to take matters into their own hands. And Preston disappeared the day after the shooting. I assumed he'd moved on to other schemes. Victoria's laugh held no humor. Clearly, I was wrong. Jacob studied her face, reading the truth in her steady gaze and the tension in her shoulders. He wants revenge for his partner's death and the end of his profitable swindle. And to ensure I can't testify against him if the Indian Affairs Office ever investigates the fraud, Victoria added. I kept Thomas's ledger, which details all their transactions. Jacob leaned forward. You still have it? Victoria nodded, hidden in a false bottom in my sewing chest. It seemed prudent to keep evidence of Preston's crimes. Very prudent, Jacob agreed. Though it makes you significantly more dangerous to him alive than dead. Victoria met his gaze unflinchingly. I'm aware of the danger, Mr. Rutherford. I've lived with it for a year. Jacob, he corrected gently. If we're discussing matters of life and death, we might as well use our given names. A ghost of a smile touched Victoria's lips. Jacob, then, what would you suggest I do? I've worked too hard to build a life here. I can't simply run again. No, Jacob agreed. Running only postpones the inevitable. Preston needs to be dealt with permanently. Are you suggesting murder, Mr. Jacob? I'm suggesting justice, Jacob clarified. The ledger is evidence of federal crimes. If we can get it to the proper authorities, Preston would face prison, not just for fraud, but for conspiracy to murder if we can prove he ordered the attack on your husband. Victoria's expression reflected skepticism. And how do you propose we do that before Preston and his hired killer decide to eliminate the threat I pose? We need to buy time, Jacob said, rising to pace the small room. Marshal Wyatt is a good man, but he can't arrest Preston without cause. However, if Preston were to show his hand attempt something illegal that the marshal could witness. You want to use me as bait, Victoria realized. Jacob stopped pacing to face her. No, I want to use the ledger as bait. Preston doesn't know I'm involved or that I know about his crimes. Let me take the ledger to McAllister's ranch for safekeeping. Then we let it be known that you'll be traveling to Helena next week to meet with a federal marshal about some personal business. Preston will assume I'm taking the ledger to the authorities. Victoria nodded slowly. He'll need to act before I leave. And when he does, we'll be ready, Jacob confirmed. But first, I need to speak with Marshal Wyatt privately, without alerting Preston. As they formulated their plan, the distance between them seemed to shrink. Jacob found himself noticing details about Victoria he'd overlooked before: the determination in her blue eyes, the quiet strength in her bearing, the intelligence that informed her questions and suggestions. For her part, Victoria discovered that Jacob's competence extended beyond physical capability to strategic thinking and careful planning. By the time they finished discussing the details, night had fallen over Silver Falls. Jacob rose to leave, but hesitated at the door. "Victoria," he said quietly, "there's something else you should know about me." She looked up from where she was retrieving the ledger from its hiding place. "Yes. Before the war, I was a deputy U.S. Marshal in Illinois. After, I spent 5 years as a Pinkerton agent, specializing in fraud and corporate theft cases." Victoria's eyes widened slightly. "You're not just a ranch hand." "The ranch work is real enough it keeps me grounded when the memories get too loud," Jacob explained. "But I still do occasional work for the agency, which is why I recognize Dane and why I believe I can help you. Why didn't you tell me this sooner?" Jacob's smile was tinged with regret. "Professional habit. I don't advertise my background. It tends to make people nervous. Or feel safer," Victoria countered, handing him the ledger. "Thank you for trusting me with the truth." Jacob's hand covered hers briefly as he accepted the book. "Thank you for the same courtesy. I'll return tomorrow with news from the marshal." After Jacob departed, Victoria sat alone in her small apartment, mind racing. For the first time since Thomas's death, she felt something beyond the constant vigilance and carefully contained fear that had become her daily companions. She felt hope, and perhaps something more dangerous still, attraction to a man who saw her clearly and didn't flinch from what he discovered. The following day passed with excruciating slowness. Victoria maintained her normal routine, though she kept her shop door locked, admitting customers individually after confirming their identity. Shortly after noon, Marshal Wyatt strolled past, tipping his hat in a manner that told her he'd spoken with Jacob. By closing time, Victoria's nerves were stretched taut with anticipation and dread. The knock at her back door came precisely at 7. Jacob entered quickly, his expression serious but not grim. "Preston's men have been watching your shop all day," he informed her. "Wyatt's deputized me temporarily, which gives us some legal standing if things go sideways." "And the plan?" Victoria asked. "Still in place. Tomorrow morning, you'll visit the stagecoach office and purchase a ticket to Helena for Monday's stage. Make sure you're seen carrying a small case or parcel that could conceivably hold the ledger. Then return here and wait." Victoria nodded, though anxiety fluttered in her stomach. "And if Preston decides to act before then, I'll be nearby," Jacob assured her. "And Marshal Wyatt has arranged for 2 trusted men to keep watch tonight." "You won't be alone, Victoria." The use of her given name sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. "Thank you, Jacob, for believing me, for helping." Jacob's weathered face softened. "I've spent my life learning to read people, Victoria. You're not a murderer or a schemer. You're a survivor." Their eyes held for a long moment before Jacob cleared his throat. "I should go. Need to get into position before full dark." Victoria walked him to the door. "Be careful." "Always am," he replied with a faint smile. "Lock this behind me and don't open it for anyone but me or Wyatt, understood?" Understood. As predicted, Preston made his move the following night. Victoria had purchased her stage ticket that morning, making a show of placing a small wrapped package in her reticule afterward. She'd spent the day in her shop, working on orders and pretending not to notice the man loitering across the street, watching her windows. Shortly after midnight, the sound of splintering wood jolted Victoria from a light doze in her chair. She grabbed her revolver and moved quickly to the bedroom, positioning herself beside the door as heavy footsteps ascended her stairs. "Search everything," a cultured voice commanded Preston, she assumed. "The ledger must be here somewhere." Victoria held her breath as men moved through her small apartment, appending furniture and ripping open cushions. When the bedroom door crashed open, she remained perfectly still in the shadows. "Nothing in the shop below," a gruff voice reported. "Just fabric and sewing things." "It has to be here," Preston insisted. She wouldn't risk sending it ahead or leaving it with someone else. Adams doesn't trust anyone, that's why she survived this long. Victoria's finger tightened on the trigger as a tall figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the lamplight from the sitting room. Before she could fire, however, the distinct sound of a shotgun being cocked echoed from the stairwell. "That's far enough, gentlemen," Marshal Wyatt's voice rang out. "You're all under arrest for breaking and entering. Drop your weapons." Instead of complying, one of the men, Dane, Victoria presumed, whirled toward the stairs, firing twice in rapid succession. The marshal's shotgun roared in response, and chaos erupted in the small apartment. Victoria remained hidden, knowing that revealing her position would only complicate matters for Wyatt and Jacob. The gunfight was brief but devastating. When silence fell, Victoria heard Jacob's voice calling her name. "Here," she responded, stepping carefully from her hiding place, gun still ready. Jacob appeared in the doorway, a bleeding gash across his forehead, but otherwise unharmed. "Are you hurt?" "No," Victoria assured him, her eyes moving past him to the sitting room, where 3 bodies lay motionless. "Preston, dead," Jacob confirmed grimly. "So is Dane. The third man's wounded, but alive. He'll stand trial for his part in this and the other crimes." Marshal Wyatt appeared behind Jacob, his left arm hanging awkwardly. "Mrs. Adams, glad to see you unharmed. Sorry about the mess." Victoria lowered her revolver slowly, the reality of the situation washing over her. "It's over? Truly over. Preston won't trouble you again," Jacob assured her, stepping closer to examine her for injuries despite her assurances. "And the ledger provides evidence of his crimes, which should clear your name in Copper Creek if you care about such things." "I don't," Victoria admitted. "Not anymore. Silver Falls is my home now." By dawn, the bodies had been removed to the undertakers, statements had been taken, and Victoria's apartment had been secured as best as possible given the broken door and bullet-riddled walls. Marshal Wyatt, his arm properly bandaged, had escorted the surviving member of Preston's gang to the town jail. Jacob, who had refused to leave Victoria alone in the damaged apartment, sat across from her at her small table as sunlight began to filter through the curtains. "What will you do now?" Victoria asked, watching as he cleaned his revolver with practiced movements. "Was planning to head back to Blackwater, but I'm reconsidering," Jacob replied, his eyes meeting hers. "Seems to me Silver Falls might need another lawman, especially with Wyatt's arm out of commission for a while." Victoria smiled faintly. "And is that the only reason you're considering staying?" Jacob set his cleaned weapon aside. "No, madam, it is not. There's a certain dressmaker I've grown rather fond of, despite her tendency to attract trouble." "I believe the trouble is behind me now," Victoria said softly. "Good," Jacob nodded. "Because I'd like to court you properly, Victoria Adams. No rush, no pressure. Just 2 people getting to know each other without bullets flying or criminals breaking down doors." Victoria studied him for a long moment. "People will talk, you know. The widow who buried 3 husbands, they'll warn you away." Jacob's laugh was warm and genuine. "Let them talk. I've never much cared for other people's opinions." His expression grew serious. "I know loss, Victoria. I know what it means to build walls to protect what's left of your heart. But I also know that sometimes the right person makes those walls unnecessary." Victoria felt something tight and painful in her chest begin to loosen for the first time in years. "Are you suggesting you might be that person, Jacob Rutherford?" "I'm suggesting we find out," he replied simply. "And I promise you this if you'll have me. I'll be the last man you'll ever need to bury." Victoria's laughter, bright and surprised, filled the sunlit room. "That's a rather morbid way to court a lady, Mr. Rutherford." "Perhaps," Jacob conceded with a grin. "But it's honest. And I think we've both had enough deception to last a lifetime." Victoria reached across the table, her hand finding his. "Honesty is a good place to start." 3 months later, on a crisp October afternoon, Victoria stood beside Jacob in Silver Falls Small Church, exchanging vows before a congregation that had come to respect and even admire the seamstress who had faced down dangerous men with courage and dignity. Jacob, now Silver Falls' second marshal, looked at her not with the caution her previous husbands had eventually developed, but with clear-eyed understanding and unwavering commitment. "I do," Victoria said firmly, her voice carrying to the back of the church. As Jacob slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, she felt not the trepidation that had accompanied her previous marriages, but a sense of rightness and peace. That night, in the new house they had purchased at the edge of town, Jacob pulled Victoria into his arms. "Happy, Mrs. Rutherford?" Victoria smiled up at the man who had seen past her carefully constructed defenses to the woman beneath. "Yes, Marshal Rutherford, I believe I am." "Good." Jacob murmured against her hair. Because I meant what I said, I'll be the last man you'll ever need. Or want, Victoria added softly, rising on tiptoes to kiss him. And in the years that followed through the birth of their children, the growth of Silver Falls from mining town to proper city, and the inevitable challenges of life in the still wild West, Jacob Rutherford kept his promise. Victoria buried no more husbands, finding instead a partnership that balanced her strength with his, her caution with his steadfastness, creating a love story that became something of a legend in Silver Falls, the tale of the widow who buried 3 husbands, until she found the one man who refused to leave her side.